Old maps present a very weird problem to the historian. The problem that we run into when we start to look at maps that have been created within, let's say, the past 800 years or so. We'll use that as our benchmark. And that will also be running off of mainstream chronological timelines. But when we look at maps, all the way back until 800, maybe 900 years old, if they're legitimate, we find a situation to where there are all kinds of fictional land masses drawn all over the place. It's either entire continent-sized land masses that are on these maps that do not exist in today's world, or we find all kinds of islands all over the place that also no longer exist in today's day and age. The question is why? Why do we find that our ancestors decided to draw maps representing land masses, or lack thereof land, that is not representative of what we see today? What I want to cover in this show is the possibility that we might actually have real scientific answers as to why all kinds of ancient maps represent an Earth
that does not look like the planet we live on today.
This is a very serious problem. And it's a problem that mainstream historians have completely written off, and they claim they have solved the mystery. So before we go and get into all the cool stuff and the real science and the real cartography and the real possibilities of why there are phantom landmasses on old maps, let's go over to our good buddies over in the mainstream and let's go see what methodologies they use to cope with the existence of these kinds of maps. Now, as most alternative researchers know at this point in time, the mainstream apparently has an answer for everything. So if you are an alternative historian and you are just following evidence, and your evidence starts to lead you to other conclusions that do not line up with the mainstream narrative, you are going to be summarily ignored, right? We all know that. We've all been there probably to one degree or another. So how is it that mainstream historians are so sure that they can ignore anybody else trying to bring in new evidence to explain the ancient maps? What do they have? I mean, they must have some sort of amazing scientific answers that absolutely proves everything if they are going to write off other people's hard work as, wrong, as fictitious and stuff like that. So they must have the real story. What does the mainstream do to cope with all of these weird maps? There's a few things these guys will do. And as a quick side note, they're not 100% wrong, by the way. We're still dealing with humans and human mistakes and human greed and stuff like that. So I'm going to cover this stuff. I'm not saying every single thing I'm about to say is 100% inaccurate. There's some truth to some of these subjects, but it's not the 100% truth. This is not, these ideas we're about to go over are not catch-alls for everything that allows you to discard any newer evidence or any other newer possibilities that might actually explain what the hell is going on with all these weird maps. So one of the first excuses that a mainstream person will throw at you is they will simply play off our ancestors were stupid idiot cavemen and they did not truly understand how to map the world. So it's just basic human error that you find literally continent-sized land masses in areas to where we know for a fact that there are none. Now, this excuse on the surface seems very logical, and like I said a little earlier, I don't disagree with it completely. Yes, of course, humans are going to make errors, and some of the maps we will cover will exemplify some of those errors. However, that does not mean that every single map that is representing a phantom landmass is fake or inaccurate. Just because some cartographers maybe made some mistakes, does that mean that every single cartographer made every single same mistake constantly? No, that is not an accurate scientific statement. Yes, there are going to be mistakes, but to say that every single cartographer that was adding all of these phantom landmasses to it were all mistaken, we don't have proof of that. I mean, we literally do not have the scientific evidence to support that claim. But a mainstream historian will absolutely ride that to the bitter end. Because, well, to be blunt, the reason why they can do that is because of what I just said. You can't scientifically prove that it's right, but you can't scientifically prove that it's wrong either. You see how messed up the mainstream is? Like, they use the most underhanded tricks to hand wave away potential paradigm shifts. It's some of the most disrespectful garbage you could imagine. And that's the stuff that you really want to go chase these people around with. You know, you go down to the hardware store, you buy an axe, you start grinding it up, sharpening it up, right? And then you climb up to a tall rock or something like that, and then you pull out your machete, rip your shirt off so your muscles are all bulging in the wind and it starts raining, and then you take your machete and you slowly slice a thin line of blood across your rippling pecs, and then you look down at the university and you look down at the historical department and you realize that historians are in there and that the hunt must begin. You bring your machete up to your lips and you lick the blood that you drew from yourself because you know that it is time for all historians to be slaughtered. Unfortunately, what we find in mainstream academia is that historians will simply use the "our ancestors were dumb monkeys" excuse to essentially get out of having to explain why those land masses exist on the maps. Now, that's a very simple excuse, and it's also extraordinarily effective. Because like I said, you can't really prove it pro or false. Or can you? So we'll get into that in just a little bit. The next thing that the historians will say is they will say that yes, they maybe mapped a certain island, but they just put it in the wrong area. And yes, that happened as well. We have to acknowledge that back in the day, depending on when the map was being, mapped, what tools did they use for their cartography purposes out there, on the ships and stuff when they were sailing around? Is it possible that the longitudes and latitudes of shorelines were off-putting? Yes, it's entirely possible, and it did happen quite a bit, that the sailors, they did their best, they did what they could, they gave it to the map makers tried to translate it, and it goes from there, and all kinds of mistakes are going to be built up in that. Which brings us to the next problem of ancient map making, and that is mistakes would have compounded on top of mistakes. Now, this is also a very real situation, because what was going on back in the day with ancient cartographers is that to build a map of the world, they didn't just hire some dude to go out on a ship and then sail around the entire planet and then, map everything as they did it and then come back, and then that cartographer would then, start completely fresh. That's not how it worked. What was going on back in the day is that people were using each other's maps as what they would call source maps. Everybody was using all kinds of maps and they were combining them together. They were compiling the maps and trying to create a vision of the world. So of course, if you have all kinds of maps that would potentially suffer from, inaccuracies, stuff like that, and people constantly copy those inaccuracies, right? What happens over decades and centuries? Yeah, you get a weird picture of the planet, right? So things would necessarily get odd. And that happened as well. I'm not denying any of that, by the way. So I want to make sure that before we start all of this, that we understand that yes, cartography back in the day absolutely had hurdles it had to jump over. It had problems that it had to start figuring out. And while they were doing all of this, they were making mistakes, and then due to the nature of cartography and the usage of source maps, those mistakes could potentially compound each other over time, and they did. But does that mean that every single landmass we see there on the planet never existed? The answer that mainstream historians would give would be a resounding yes, of course. If our ancestors were all stupid monkeys, they must have messed up big time, and we know they messed up here and there. That must mean that every single thing on these maps was completely fictitious and stupid, and there's no reason to dig into it further. That is quite literally the mainstream's position. And, unbeknownst to them, apparently, it is a completely unscientific position. We cannot come to that conclusion definitively when we start to look at ancient maps. I was going to do a different kind of show, but now we're doing this. That's all right. This will set us up for the next show that I actually wanted to do. But now, this is good. Let's go over the basics of the possibilities of what's wrong with ancient maps, and let's see if we can start to build a foundation that will allow us to allow a paradigm shift to enter into our lexicon when it comes to geography. You like that word salad? Oh yeah! Yes, my lexicon grows stronger by the day. So, of course, ancient maps are going to be an important resource, not just because of the geography, and obviously, having a good grasp on what our ancestors knew of geography is going to give us an insight into how they were thinking, what they were doing, what they were seeing. But map making also potentially gives us an insight into what previously ancient cultures may have been doing before what we would consider, say, the age of sail, right? The age of discovery. What am I talking about? What's going on? Okay, so remember how I said earlier that when, the people who were the cartographers who were making maps between, 11 or 1200 AD to 1800 AD, whatever, around that period of time, one of the tools that these cartographers would use would be using source maps to build their maps of the planet. Now, when the topic of source maps comes up, historians will generally relegate all of the source maps that they will be talking about or that were potentially used to create a map of the world to the same time period, essentially. So by that I mean, if somebody was drawing up a map in the 1400s AD, and that map may have used source maps, those source maps may only really be 100 or 200 years old, relative to what the mainstream would believe. Now, that's not entirely wrong, because of course that was happening. The source map thing is a real process, and of course a map drawn in the 1400s would more than likely use source maps from the 13 and 12s. Understood, 100% correct, no problem. Here's where mainstream historians lose the trail. If you are a cartographer in, let's just say the 1400s, we'll just roll with that. If you live in the 1400s, not only are you probably going to have access to maps from people in the past 100 or 200 years, for sure, that would make sense, but you might also have access to maps that we are not aware of today. By that I mean somebody living in the 1400s will have a much better chance of probably getting their hands on a map from, say, 800 AD or maybe 600 AD. For the simple reason is that A, they are simply just closer to that time period, so the chances for an older map to have survived that long would be higher than, say, it's surviving up until today's period of time. And B, if you are living in the 1400s, which of course is 600 years away from us, you have not had that 600 years of greedy organizations running around and grabbing artifacts en masse on the planet the way these people are able to grab them and conceal them nowadays, because that just didn't exist back then. People were not flying around in airplanes whenever they knew an artifact was around, swoop in there with some highly paid military people, grab what you need, and leave. Right? That was not happening at that scale. It was still going on, don't get me wrong, right? The Vatican was alive and well in this period of time, but somebody living in the 1400s does not have an extra 600 years of obfuscation of history to deal with. Now, of course, they had their own problems to deal with, no doubt. But the reality is, these cartographers during the 1400s potentially would have had access to all kinds of maps that you and I either don't have access to at all nowadays, or we know they exist and we are not allowed to see them because they are in a private collection somewhere. And I am being very, very polite by saying a private collection. Anyway, from a scientific perspective, we would really have every reason to believe that map makers in the 1400s simply had access to other kinds of information that does not exist today. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we hear somebody, especially from the mainstream, try to write off all these maps which display land masses that no longer exist today. And it's not just land masses, by the way. We also find all kinds of very interesting features on ancient maps. I'm not really going to get into that right now, but it's just something to keep in mind in the back of your head whenever you look at maps. Look around for the features that the map makers themselves draw attention to with whatever kind of graphic they throw in there. It changes things up a little bit. If cartographers had access to other kinds of maps, to other kinds of written works that would have helped them compile their world maps, it really does beg the question, what kind of stuff were these people looking at? As I pointed out earlier, one of the things that historians will simply do when they look at these maps and they try to make excuses to, ignore them and move on with life, they will simply say that, hey, look, all the source maps that were used by the explorers, by the cartographers during the Age of Sail, essentially, I'll just use that term, they were all, generally speaking, contemporaneous with one another. They do this because if they start to acknowledge the possibility that these cartographers had access to a lot of information that your average historian does not nowadays, that puts your average mainstream historian in one hell of a bind. Because what that scientifically proves is that historians really don't have a good grasp on what was going on throughout history. To make matters even worse for your mainstream historian, there are countless examples of precedents of our ancestors in the 1400s, I'll stick with our example, having access to works that we do not have access to anymore. It's not just in cartography, you find it all over the place in the written literature. So we know for a scientific fact that they were looking at stuff that we cannot view today. That is one hell of a claim, right? That statement really should have given pause to every single historian that has ever existed on this planet. And in all honesty, History 101, this is one of the things that they should really point out, is that they should say, hey, look, all the people that existed, 800 years ago, they absolutely had access to information from what would have been their ancient past that we do not have today. Once we start to look at history with this in mind, everything necessarily has to change. Now, I'm going to do my best and just focus on maps. No, I'm going to do it. Not my best. I will do it. If you think about what I just said, that these people back during the Age of Sail had access to information about their ancients that we do not have access to right now, it begs the question, what was that information? Now, the interesting part of this whole situation when it comes to cartography is that since the cartographers were trying to get their hands on any map they possibly could so that they could create the atlas of the world, they were absolutely getting their hands on some fairly ancient maps. Now, how ancient? We'll talk about that just a second, because we do have to deal with chronology if we are going to get into the real science of what is going on with map making and what these maps may actually be telling us. But for now, I'll just stick with mainstream stuff. We'll get there. Here, let's do this. Let's build a case for our foundation, and then we'll go from there. On the screen now is a map from the 1500s. I believe it was 1592 in which this map was created. And this map is called the Priori Hemispheri Tortusque Geographici, something like that, okay? I don't know. I think that's Latin. I'm dumb. I don't know how to read. Okay, anyway. This map is from the 1500s. Okay, cool, right? Age of sail, period of time. Things have gotten a little more advanced. Cartography's up and running a lot better than it was just 100 years ago, for example. But what we find even as late as 1592 is that we find all kinds of weird land masses represented on this map. Why? I mean, even by 1592, a lot of stuff had already been figured out. And yet, when we look at the North Pole of this particular map, we find several continent-sized land masses encircling the North Pole. Now, that's crazy in and of itself, and that is what most people are going to focus on. But let's look at other spots as well. If you come down to the south, you will find that there are other islands represented that no longer exist either. So, for example, you will see Friesland represented in this map. Friesland is another one of these ghost islands that kept popping up all over the place around this period of time, and earlier especially, until finally somebody went out there and finally proved that it doesn't exist. Now, right off the bat, we technically have a very serious problem. This island is not that far away from all the people doing all the sailing, right? It's right there next to Europe. That island, Friesland, for some weird reason, continuously pops up on maps for hundreds of years. Some of the maps literally have names of all the stuff on the island. They map out all the interior, the rivers, the mountains, etc. I mean, it may as well have just been a real island. And for all intents and purposes, it was, according to the map makers. Once somebody finally went out there and, finally figured out that it does not exist, then it started to be erased from maps. But it's very interesting to note that cartographers who literally lived right next to it, and that, explorers were always going out there, they were not able to prove that that island did not exist, until the 1500s to the 1600s. Then it started to be erased. What the hell is going on? How do you make that kind of a mistake? Is it possible to make that kind of a mistake? And yeah, it is. I mean, if we're honest, and I have to be intellectually honest, yes, it is possible that the explorers and the cartographers made a mistake. That is a possibility. However, it also still begs the question, is it possible that that island did exist and only disappeared, in the 1400s, 1500s, around that period of time? Is that a real possibility? Scientifically speaking, yes, it is. I'm not going to get too much into Friesland. Friesland is a fascinating topic, but I just wanted to point out that there are other things on this amazing map that people generally don't really pay attention to. Everybody immediately looks at the North Pole, and that's where everybody stays focused on. So let's go up to the North Pole situation. For whatever reason, it was very common, once again, for map makers to put these 4 semicircular land masses, orbiting around the North Pole. And by the way, in the middle of this map and many maps before this, the very North Pole itself is generally denoted by this huge mountain magnetite or some sort of a magnetic stone, I guess depending on what map you look at, and that this area of the Earth is what was generating the poles. This is why, the compasses would point, towards the north, etc. This has obviously been proved not correct at this point, now that we have Birkeland currents and we understand electromagnetism. But despite that, it is still interesting that people would draw that on there. It's just one of those features, okay? Anyway, the land masses is what we want, are what we want to focus on. Now, these 4 land masses are going to be familiar to most people as the potential of being Hyperborea. Maybe it was, I have no idea, right? Because right now, in modern times, these 4 islands or continents or whatever you want to call them, they don't exist anymore. So I can't really say anything about whether it was or it wasn't, who knows. The point is that they were willing to add these 4 islands to their map as if they were real. Why? I mean, why would they waste their time? And where did this even come from anyways? I mean, did some explorer claim that he went up there and this is what he found, and then he came back and said, hey, here's this new map that I drew for you guys, add it into everything that you have? I mean, I guess that kind of happened. We do see back in the day of sailors coming back with all kinds of stories, right? I mean, history is full of sailors running into all kinds of phantom stuff. That's just typical sailor stuff. And unfortunately, I think a lot of things that maybe some of those guys were saying may have been true, but it was ignored because the vast majority of the stuff that these guys would report was either generally outright false because, they just wanted to get free beer or something at the tavern, or they were simply mistaken by what they saw. So, sailors started to lose their credibility, when it came to this stuff. And especially as more people started exploring, people eventually made it up to the North Pole area and they said, hey, there's nothing here. All right, that whatever Hyperborea thing we have on our maps, it does not exist anymore, at least. If we have cartographers during the Age of Sail compiling the maps, and they're using source maps, it begs the question, what is the oldest source map that these cartographers had access to? Or not just source map, I mean source maps. What kind of information was known to them back then that we do not know nowadays, simply because the second law of thermodynamics has gotten in the way, right? I mean, not everything lasts forever. We're 600 plus years away from a lot of this stuff. What were they looking at? And also, why would they be willing to record these kinds of continents and land masses in their map? I mean, what gave them the confidence in any capacity whatsoever that this is something they should do? One of the things you guys have to remember is that these maps, maybe not this particular map, but maps were used for legitimate navigation. So if you were making a map that was not at least a honest attempt to try and guide people to the right area, yeah, people are going to be pissed when they get out there and they find nothing there, right? I mean, they're going to sail out there, they're going to find that the map is wrong, and then you're going to have an entire ship of pissed off sailors coming back for your throat. So it's not really in the best interest for a cartographer to just throw stuff in there and say, oh yeah, it's all good in the hood, bro. Just take the map. Yeah, I'm sure that island exists. Yeah, just go out there. It doesn't matter. That is not what they would have been doing. This is something that I feel a lot of people lose track of, both on the alternative side and the mainstream history side. It's the human aspect. These cartographers, they were not out to deceive the people, generally speaking, that they were selling their maps to. I mean, they were, they provided a product, and to get return customers, you've got to have a good product. You cannot put out a garbage map and then expect to get repeat business. It's not going to happen. And in fact, like I said, you might actually get killed for doing that kind of a thing, right? It's one thing to make a mistake, which cartographers did, and of course sailors were aware of, but it's a whole other business when you start adding non-existent land masses. For example, looking at this map, if we want to sail north, and I want to find those 4 islands, they better be there, because if you're going to the North Pole, that place sucks. That's a hard place to sail around and survive in. So if you're going to go up there, those land masses better be there. And if they're not, then, we got to start talking to the cartographer and start slapping him around and start finding him and grab him by his throat and just start choking him and just start slapping him. That is what would happen to a cartographer. And I promise you, the cartographers were not interested in being choked out on the street while people kicked him in the head. I don't think that they were looking to do that. So we need to remember that these maps were not drawn lightly. These maps were drawn with legitimate purpose. So keep that in mind as we go through this. These guys were not trying to deceive. So what that means then is that these guys, and by the way, cartographers had to be of a certain kind of intellectual capability. Not the way I speak. Of course, I am not intellectually capable, as I just butchered that sentence. What I meant to say is that a cartographer had to be generally intelligent, especially because there was going to be a lot of geometry and trigonometry involved in plotting out all of the coordinates. So you couldn't just be, stupid and start drawing stuff on the back of a napkin and sell it. It wasn't going to work, and it wasn't going to happen. These people took their jobs very seriously. So when they would go and they would look at their source maps, they would have to be judicious on a very serious level on what they were going to include in the map. So it's fascinating to me that we find something like Hyperborea registered up there at the North Pole. What that tells us is that potentially these guys, well, not even potentially, they admit it. I think they actually tell us about the map that these came from. Anyway, they had access to a map that was drawn with these land masses, and from their perspective, it was real enough to include it into their own map. That means that the source map that they were looking at was a legitimate piece of geographical information in their eyes. What that does for us as historians is that gives us an insight or a window into what they felt was a priority, into what they felt was a real world situation. What that basically means is that these guys were holding on to maps that were intricately drawn and already had aspects of the planet mapped out to a high detailed degree, even while the age of sail was going on and people were essentially starting from scratch trying to map out the world. Right? It's one hell of a paradox. It appears, by all intents and purposes, that cartographers in the 1100s, 1200s AD, etc., they already had access to maps that were representative of the planet. That is one hell of an interesting conclusion, but it's one that we have no choice but to gravitate towards given the evidence, given the historical evidence, and then ultimately given the scientific evidence. We'll do a lot of the science in another show. There's a lot to go over here. I just want to build up the possibilities that we can get out of ancient maps before we start to dig into that stuff, because we need to take this seriously. All right. So what the hell kind of maps did these guys have access to? How did these guys have access to world maps which were already mapped out? What the hell is going on? And the last question would be, what the hell happened to all of the land masses that the cartographers believed existed and are now gone? Where are they? Now this brings us to our bread and butter. Now we can start talking about catastrophism. And a little chronology as well. So, what we are looking at is we are looking at a situation to where cartographers during the Age of Sail apparently already had access to some source maps that were mapping out situations all over the planet. And this includes Antarctica without ice. And if you look at the map I have on the screen, well, it's the same map we've been looking at this whole time, basically. Unless I remembered to change the picture during editing, which I probably won't, in which case you are still looking at the same map. Regardless, anyway, if you look at the map that we've been staring at, What you will also see is that even Greenland on this map is represented without ice. What do you think about that? How is it that a cartographer in the 1500s felt confident enough to map out Greenland's inner geography? That's one hell of a claim. I mean, did they just make it up? Were they bored? Did they need to fill in space? Or did they actually have access to a source map which shows the interior of Greenland without ice? I mean, what makes more sense? Them making stuff up, or that they may have physically had a source map that shows that information? Now, okay, for the skeptic, you could probably go 50-50, because you could say, well, he did need to just fill up space. You know, it looks better that way. And the reality is anybody really going to use this particular map for studying and trying to, you know, take an expedition into Greenland? You know, probably not. Probably no one's going to do that. As long as you kind of get the general shoreline right, you should be okay, right? And then you could just fill in the rest for fun. You could say that, and I would give you that a little bit. I guess I'll budge on that. But on the flip side, we could also simply make the claim that somebody just happened to have mapped out Greenland before that ice cap formed. That is also a scientific possibility, and that's something we'll discuss in the next show, because that gets fascinating. Anyway, these maps, they show all kinds of information. Not only land masses that no longer exist, but geography of land masses that nobody has any right to know about up until very recently, right? It's only been very recent that scientists were able to get a correct scan of the whole continent over there, or the landmass, or whatever they call it nowadays, and see what's under the ice. Funnily enough, even on the map right here of Greenland, on this map, you can actually see aspects of the inner terrain line up with what was discovered from the Greenland scan. So something is going on. We have a problem here. And this is the kind of evidence which really should have put a huge shock through historians everywhere once they saw those Greenland scans, and then they compare them against maps. This map up here is not a good one for Greenland. I mean, it's just a general one. But there are maps of Greenland who have even more detail about the interior of Greenland, and they line up almost perfectly with what was discovered with those under the ice scans. This is I don't care who you are. This is a problem. How the hell were people in the 1500s able to map out Greenland even though it's covered in literally thousands upon thousands of feet of ice? Where did they get this information? We can only assume, and we're only going to focus on the maps, that these guys must have had detailed maps of items like Greenland without ice. So if they have these kinds of maps, if, you know, they had access to this kind of information, we then need to ask the next question: where the hell did this come from? We have a few problems, right? So first of all, with respect to, let's just say, Greenland, the problem with Greenland is that mainstream science believes that ice is like 150,000 years old. I believe that's their current benchmark for the ice on Greenland. So if we have maps which are displaying the interior of Greenland without ice, you know, in the 14 and 1500s, and even earlier, actually, what the hell's going on? Because, I mean, that information would have been available to nobody up until, you know, now. So how do we reconcile this? And then, of course, extending the question is also, how do we reconcile the fact that we have all of these phantom land masses in the area as well? Well, the answer is technically simple. Their source maps, those maps that you and I no longer have access to, and well, I mean, I would love to find them, but we will probably never see them, must have necessarily contained that data. Those mappings must have existed on whatever the source maps were that they had access to. All right, so that begs the next question. Where the hell are these maps? And who the hell drew them? These are legitimate scientific questions that historians need to ask. Now, for those people who have asked these questions on the alternative mainstream side of things, unfortunately, most of those people still adhere to the theory of uniformitarianism. They're still loyal to their programming, so they believe the 150,000 year benchmark, for example, for the ice of Greenland. So for their explanation, they have to think of some super ultra ancient civilization that existed 150,000 years ago, and they had flying cars and microwaves, and they were slapping each other with squirt guns and stuff. I don't know, whatever. They were highly advanced, and they must have mapped out Greenland back in the day. This theory is wrong, generally speaking, because two reasons. First reason, we have no evidence of that civilization. Well, there's a lot of reasons. Two, we have no way of proving a civilization that dated back to that time period existed, as we have no reliable dating systems to use that would give us a date like that. Which then leads us into the problem, of course, the ice sheet and the ice sheet state, but back to the supposed ancient civilization that would have mapped out Greenland, and then, of course, Antarctica, if you want to get into all of that. And, of course, these people would have mapped out all these other land masses as well that no longer exist. The other problem that we run into with respect to that is we have to ask ourselves, how did that information last for 150,000 years for some map maker, in the 1500s to get his hands on it? But you ultimately still have to deal with the second law of thermodynamics. 150,000 years, it's a long time for information to get lost, changed, etc., right? 150,000 years, So when we look at it like that, does it really make sense that a civilization 150,000 years mapped that? Probably not. What that means, though, then, if that didn't happen 150,000 years ago, it does beg the question, when? So this will bring us into catastrophism. If those source maps are accurate, if somebody back in the day, at some point in time in history, was really able, to sail around the planet and start mapping out the continent shorelines and even explore the interiors of continents which are no longer accessible, we have to ask how they were doing this. Because, if it's not 150,000 years ago, does that mean that it's some futuristic civilization that's maybe, 4,000 years old or something like that? Once again, we run into all those weird hypotheticals because we have to deal with an ice sheet, for example, in Greenland, right? How were they able to tell if that ice, what was underneath the ice sheet, if they did not have advanced technology, right? You would have to be able to scan, and who the hell was doing that back in the day? Well, that is what everybody is going to generally gravitate towards, or that kind of an explanation is what alternative mainstream people will look at, because, that the pet theory that everybody has nowadays about this amazing ancient, advanced civilization that did all this crazy stuff has now basically brain rotted the entire community to a pretty good degree, right? So most people are just going to say, well, yes, somebody back in the day had Star Trek technology and they just did their thing and then they died for some weird reason. And then, yeah, life went on. And then somebody found the tricorder and then they were able to take the tricorder data and transcribe that onto a map. And then the Freemasons came over and stole the tricorder and, whatever you want to make up, right? You can have fun with that all day long. However, there may be another explanation. For example, we have now learned that the ice sheet over Greenland is not 150,000 years old. Remember, I've talked about this before in another show, but ice core data is completely unreliable. It just doesn't work at all, right? So once we throw out the ice core dating from the mainstream and we look at the actual objective scientific evidence, what geologists, good, real geologists, discovered is that the ice sheet is relatively new. And by relatively new, I am not talking like 100,000 years or 50,000 years or anything like that. What has been discovered is that the ice sheet of Greenland is no more than a couple of thousand years old at best. Suddenly, everything starts to change when we realize that that ice sheet on Greenland did not exist 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. So now if you have a culture out there that is mapping the planet, they hit Greenland, you don't need spaceships and tricorders. All you need is general intelligence and basic skills, and you can start to map out Greenland. This is where the science is leading us. Now let's move on to the actual continents and land masses that are represented on maps as well. So right now, science is starting to show us that something like that really thick ice cap on Greenland is not that old. What that means is that something catastrophic must have happened to pile ice up thousands of feet on one very particular continent. I mean, if you went outside right now and suddenly you were, just snowed in with under like 20 feet of snow in an hour, that would be a problem. And if that kept happening over the week, you'd be screwed. That would be fairly catastrophic, and that would be a fairly quick catastrophe. Now, we're not going to get into the Greenland ice sheet, but what I wanted to point out is that the Greenland ice sheet's mere existence is literally catastrophic in nature. Something had to have happened on this planet, to create a condition to where a huge ice sheet could pile up on one very particular landmass. Now, a lot of mainstream people are going to say, well, that's just left over from the Ice Age, blah, 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 blah. Ice Age is not a real thing. This has been scientifically proven in so many ways that it's hilarious nowadays that anybody believes in the Ice Age theory. But Greenland's a funny one, because what the scientists discovered in Greenland is that areas that should have been completely glaciated, if the Ice Age theory was true, were never glaciated. How do you like that? How do you explain that? And they don't. Mainstream geologists do not explain it because they can't. And so they ignore it so they can continue to work with the Ice Age theory. So if we get rid of the Ice Age theory and just throw all that stuff away, and that means Greenland is not a remnant of it, that means something had to have happened to create that kind of an ice pack situation. If we have something catastrophic doing that to a place like Greenland, what's going on the rest of the planet? Well, once again, we can go and we can read what our ancestors said happened. Our ancestors talk about all kinds of islands sinking, don't they? They talk about continents literally sinking, and they also recorded islands being risen from the ocean. If we take them seriously, which we are going to, that means we can start to look at these source maps in a different light. What if the land masses that we are seeing on all of these maps that technically do not exist today actually did exist sometime in recent history? In fact, it gets even more interesting, because if we are going to take what our ancestors say for real, that means we should expect to find maps with all kinds of other land masses that do not exist today. So this starts to make sense. That means that we should expect cartographers to have access potentially to other maps which would have recorded a completely different Earth. Now, here's where the compilation problems would have come into play. So as people and explorers are going out there, during the age of sail, and they're out there, mapping what they can find and stuff like that, and they start to bring that information back to the cartographers on the mainland, what the cartographers start to notice is that the stuff that the sailors are bringing back now are not lining up with their ancient source maps. So this becomes a problem for them. So as people start to explore Africa, for example, the coastlines start to shift, right? It's funny, the further back you go on a lot of maps with respect to Africa, you find all of the African interior completely mapped out. Not only do you find the entire continent mapped out, you find all the topography, the geography, the flora and the fauna mapped out, rivers that don't exist today. All of this crazy stuff is already mapped out. And then as time progresses, from like the 11 to 1200s all the way, up to the 1800s, well, 1600s, whatever. Anyway, what you find is that Africa starts out incredibly detailed, and then over time slowly becomes less detailed because people no longer feel they can trust the information of the source maps. And the reason why that's happening is because all the stuff the source maps tell us, they're not lining up with their current observation. So for example, the Sahara Desert. There are age of sail maps that literally show the Sahara Desert as a lush, temperate environment. Some maps even show Lake Tritonis still there. The problem is that when people started to explore North Africa, they didn't find any of that, did they? They found a desert, right? They found a wasteland, essentially. So what happened was when those explorers started coming back and they were like, dude, nothing on your map is accurate, bro. I mean, all of this stuff is wrong. The only thing that's down there is a huge desert. None of these trees exist. None of these lakes or river systems exist. What are you smoking? And then the cartographer's like, oh crap, really? Well, I guess if it's not there, then they start to erase what their original source maps told them was there. You can watch as humanity comes out from a catastrophic event and tries to rebuild itself literally by studying European maps. It's unbelievably fascinating, and we're going to do a lot more shows on this stuff. But the story is right there. So how the hell do we have source maps telling us everything that was going on in the middle of Africa when nobody had explored it yet? What's going on? To make it even more interesting with respect to the Africa example is that what was on the map relative to something like, say, river systems that would have existed in the Sahara Desert according to these ancient maps, they don't exist now, but satellite imagery has discovered that yes, these river systems used to actually exist over there in northern Africa. And of course, nowadays, everybody admits, even in the mainstream, that the Sahara Desert used to be a lush environment. And to make it even more interesting, even mainstream scientists are starting to admit that the Sahara Desert is not that old. And by not that old, I mean it's only a couple of thousand years old at best. Yeah, things are starting to get crazy when you look at the real science. So what this does for our source map situation is that it points us in the direction that there had to have been some sort of civilization, only maybe a couple of thousand years ago, at best, that was, out there maybe thriving, but at the very least, they were definitely exploring and they were mapping all of this stuff out. Now, this brings us back to the point of how old were these source maps that these cartographers, during the Age of Sail were using. They could not be 150,000 years old because the map would probably not last that long, and it does not seem like anybody had access to some super high-tech tablet left over from some ancient civilization. But if we look at the scientific evidence pointing towards a lot of the stuff on this planet now that is fairly catastrophic, so for example the Sahara Desert, the ice on Greenland, and all kinds of stuff everywhere else on the planet, suddenly it's not 150,000 years ago or millions of years ago, it's just a couple of thousand years at best. That means that civilization's maps would have had a higher chance surviving, 15 to 2,000 years before they would come into the hands of the cartographers in the Age of Sail. So all of this suddenly starts to scientifically make sense if we ask real questions and look at the science to give us a date to guide us. Now it gets even crazier. All right, so if we have a civilization mapping out the world and they are drawing all of these other land masses that are congruent with the general outline of the continents that we see nowadays, where the hell did all of these phantom land masses go in the span of a couple of thousand years? Where are they? Because, they're there on the map, but they don't exist in real life. What the hell happened? Because essentially what the science is showing us, and remember, I'm just following scientific evidence right now. I haven't used any of our ancestors' history recordings yet to prove anything. Ironically, all I have technically used so far is science that the mainstream themselves have uncovered, all right? So, we have a window of about 2,000 years. Where are these other land masses? There's a couple of answers or potential answers to this. Now, one of the things we saw on the map is we see a lot of little islands such as Friesland in existence, and it certainly seems like Friesland was not an island that existed back, way in the ancient times. It appears that Friesland was a legitimate island in like 1000 AD, maybe even 1100 to 1300 AD. There are people who talk about it in their histories as if it is a real place. It's not some sort of a fantastical place where you have, future civilizations running around. It's nothing like that. It's just another island. And if you looked at detailed maps of Friesland, you see it as such. Even more interesting, the names of all the places line up with the steppe people's names, and that's a whole situation as well. Anyways, there's nothing interesting about it technically, other than the fact that it no longer exists. What happened to that island, for example? Is it possible, is it possible that it never existed and it was a mistake? Potentially, and I admit that, okay? I'm open to that, that's fine. But is it also possible that that little island sank beneath the waves sometime in 1000 to 1200 AD-ish and then was just gone? Is that a possibility? And the scientific answer is yes. Because in the area where Friesland is represented on the ancient maps, there's actually something under the water there. All right, and we'll get into that on a different show, but there is evidence that potentially that island sank relatively recently. Now, the sinking of an island is no joke, but is that a world-ending catastrophe, or is anybody going to care about it if a small island up there in the northern hemisphere sinks? The reality is no. You'll have surrounding shorelines, might get a little bit of a tsunami here and there, or maybe more than a little bit, but otherwise the world is not going to collapse. Everything is going to go on, generally speaking. Everybody around the surrounding area of Friesland just would have had a good time surfing, and then some areas obviously would have had to deal with really malicious tsunamis. Another thing to note is that people literally record these tsunamis rushing over the European areas around this time. All right. The evidence is there, right? I'm not making any of this up. That's what's recorded, right? It's fascinating to see how many insane tsunamis are actually recorded in the European area. It's crazy stuff. But is it possible that Friesland sank overnight due to some sort of a geological process? The answer is a scientific yes. So, Friesland's an interesting case because people may have actually been sailing back and forth to it even while some of this cartography was going on, and then one day it was gone, right? And it's not there anymore, bro. I don't know. So generations later, when other explorers go out there to find it and to trade with those people, and I do believe there's actually stories of traders wondering where the hell that island went. I'd have to dig that up, but I'm pretty sure I read that. Anyway, put that on the maybe side. Now, this brings up two potential answers. The first answer, this brings up two potential explanations, and it might be an amalgamation of both, the real answer. So the first situation is that, hey, the Europeans, they knew it was there and they mapped it out on their own. They didn't necessarily need a source map to do it because it was a real island that people were interacting with regularly, right? So they could have just had an older map written by or drawn by, Europeans at that time period, and that became their source until, one day somebody went out there and said, hey, it's gone, bro, it's not here. All right, or Friesland could have been recorded from ancient source maps that people had found, and then it was just added, names and stuff like that were just added as people populated it back during the day, right? Back during maybe the 800s, 900s AD. This is all mainstream chronology, remember? That's a possibility as well. right? So it's entirely possible that Friesland existed on the source maps, maybe blank, right? Maybe they just had the terrain in there, but there were no names. And then, settlers went over there from Europe, settled it, named everything, mapped it out, and then one day it sank. Those are all possibilities. If they sound insane, all I would say to you is, remember, everything I have said so far does not violate the law of physics. It does not violate anything with respect to science, and in fact, it's the exact opposite. Everything I've said so far has been backed up by science. So, is it possible that an island that people knew about generally sank, and then once it was gone, after a few generations, people just kind of forgot it existed, and it just became some sort of maybe a mythological tale or something in certain cultures as past? You have to remember, right? Okay, check this out. So right now, if an island were to sink today, you would think that would be a big deal, right? You would think that, the news would be covering it like crazy, that geologists would be over there going, oh wow, look at all this stuff, and, that there would be a concentration of people looking to learn from that situation. The interesting thing that happened, remember, just a few years ago, was that we actually had an island in Samoa literally vaporize itself in the blink of an eye. We have this on video. An island literally was annihilated immediately by a geological explosion. All right, island gone. See you later. Bye-bye. It made the news barely. Think about that. An entire island in the blink of an eye was wiped out, and the news of that event barely hung around. So we had a cataclysmic event happen on this planet, and almost nobody really cared about it. So if you're wondering if you think that the sinking of an island would be like a huge big deal, no, it's not. Even in today's connected world, we couldn't even get people to pay attention to an exploding island for more than a few days. Back then, there was no internet, right? There was no way to transmit news en masse like that. So, hey, an island goes down, and if nobody witnessed it, which probably nobody lived to tell the tale, even if they did, what do you do? I mean, how do you record that event? It's not going to matter to the vast majority of the planet, and in fact, the vast majority of the planet will never know that it ever happened. This is a real situation. So when we start to talk about catastrophes and stuff, keep that in mind. Now, can I guarantee that that is what happened to Friesland? No, I cannot. But there is a lot of very interesting evidence that does point in that direction. But more to the point is the fact, the scientific fact, that you can literally have swaths of land submerge in the ocean overnight, and it really is not going to be a big deal. So when we look at these maps and we see all these other smaller islands out there that no longer exist, I mean, is it possible that that is what happened to those islands as well? And then, of course, more to the point with respect to the map we looked at when we started this, up there in Hyperborea, did those 4 land masses actually exist but sink under the waves in relatively recent times? All possibilities. Now, let me give you guys some possible conclusions as well. So this is what I would suggest that the maps are telling us. Is it possible that these land masses that no longer exist used to exist, and not only used to exist, but existed relatively recently? Here's something that I would propose, and something that it may have actually happened like this, and we'll talk about more of the details in other shows, but here's a potential direction to look towards. So the civilization that would have mapped out islands like Friesland, who would have mapped out the interiors of Greenland, Antarctica, stuff like that, they only existed a couple of thousand years ago. Now, the first question we need to ask is, where the hell did they go, right? Because what stopped them? I mean, something had to have happened that made sure that those guys could no longer, map stuff out and progress. They had to have been relatively technologically advanced, not in the sense of electronics and stuff, but I mean technologically in the sense that they understood that the Earth was a planet, that they knew how to, map longitude and latitude, all of that stuff. So they were not monkeys. But if they were at that level of technological advancement, where are they now? I mean, shouldn't they have just kept going? You would think, especially from a mainstream perspective, that yeah, a civilization that existed like that would have just kept going because there was nothing to really stop it. Something had to stop it. Here is what I would propose. I'm going to guess, and this is just a hypothesis, so don't take it any more than that. Or hell, we can even just say it's speculation. But if we follow historical evidence and we follow scientific evidence, it paints a very interesting picture. So, the civilization that would have done this mapping would have been whatever survived the Venus event. These people would have witnessed a time period where Venus was a comet, did its flybys, and absolutely destroyed the planet, and essentially created the vast majority of the shorelines that we see today. Because remember, before the Venus event, all the continents would have been almost essentially completely different, and we literally would have had other islands and continents that existed that no longer exist. So the Venus event happens, wipes Earth out, does all of its thing, builds mountains, builds new continents, sinks other continents, etc., etc. The survivors of that event take their time. The survivors of that event would have scavenged whatever technological advancements, their civilization had that was left over. And please remember, we have evidence that civilizations were indeed that advanced a few thousand years ago. Remember, something happens on Earth to where whatever amazing things were being done, like pyramids being built, Baalbek, etc., all these crazy constructions, all this amazing data, all of those civilizations at some point literally vanish. So we know that people would have been capable of mapping out the planet to the level that they did a few thousand years ago. So anyway, the civilization or the remnants of whatever civilization this was, they scavenge what they can, and then they realize that the Earth has completely changed, and they need to go out there and they need to figure out what the new topography of Earth is. You need new maps. You need new calendars. You need all of this new stuff to record the changes that have happened since the Venus event. Because at this point, any of their older maps, they're all invalid. You can't use them anymore. You have to create new ones. So that civilization, recovers and goes out there and it starts mapping stuff. Now, here's the problem. That civilization is no longer here today, so far as I'm aware. I know we could probably get into some weird underground stuff, but on the surface level, whatever civilization picked up its pieces and tried to reinvent itself, it's gone right now. So what happened to that civilization? So that civilization goes out, starts mapping stuff, starts making records, blah, blah, blah. And then we find another cataclysm hits Earth. Now, since I'm running out of time and I'm not going to get crazy with this, we can discuss this in another show. The cataclysm that would have finished the job on these people, and of course other peoples all over the planet, by the way. It was not just this civilization. But another cataclysm hits. Now, this may be the fabled Mars-Jupiter cataclysm, where Mars and Jupiter are close by because at this point all the planets are still trying to get to their current orbits. This could have been the event that wipes them out because there's a point to where Mars suddenly becomes a problem for Earthlings. For example, you can read that in the Iliad and the Odyssey and other stories all over the place. It could have been that event, or it could have been the more recent comet event that would have happened around 500 AD, mainstream chronology-wise. All right, so I'm just going to stick with mainstream chronology. We have a lot to cover later in a different show. That event, that last semi-cataclysm, it definitely affected the planet, but it did not wipe out the planet. It really just affects a small portion of the planet. Now, you know what? I don't even know if it would be that one. Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, the main point is, and we'll explore this way later, is that some other cataclysm that was on a minor scale essentially sweeps by Earth and finishes off the civilizations that were trying to get back on their feet. That cataclysm is essentially, I think, the last cataclysm that Earthlings really had to deal with up until our period of time. This would make sense because if we look back at where we are now and we just kind of trace ourselves back, like, say, 1,000 years, it really does look like humans are just trying to get out of some sort of, or recover, I should say, that humans are trying to recover from some sort of a horrific event. Right? And that's why civilization essentially has to restart itself, and that's why it has to start remapping everything and refiguring everything out, even though, oddly enough, the further back we go in history, our ancestors appear to have had all of this stuff figured out more or less. So that's one of the problems. Anyway, so that last cataclysm comes by, just absolutely finishes the job, which means now you are just going to have remnants of the records of that civilization that originally went back out to try to remap everything after the Venus event, destroyed their entire civilization. So that's a very basic rundown of what could have potentially happened, but everything I said right there is essentially backed up by history and science. The problem of which catastrophe was the final icing on the cake for this particular civilization, we still need to figure that out. Like that we still got to find. And remember, by the way, that civilization was not flying around the planet. It wasn't teleporting. There was no computers. They were doing their best with what they had. They were operating at a high level, but they were not using anyway, like I said, computers and stuff like that. So don't forget that. They were operating in a very real world way. And that is reflected in the maps that later cartographers will draw based on their source maps. Yeah, there you go. How do you like that? I just figured all that stuff out for you guys. Anyways, my main point here is that I believe that maps that are done during the age of sail, especially the older ones you can get your hands on, they really do represent what Earth may have looked like here and there only about 1,000 years ago or so, or maybe even more recent. That's how crazy this stuff is. Remember my island example, right? You would think that an island sinking would be a huge deal, but it's nothing relative to human psychology. If you don't have to deal with it, with which much of the world would not have cared or known about, it's just not going to matter. I mean, it's irrelevant. So you can sink islands even while you have a fairly advanced civilization. Now, with all of that said, the next show we do on maps, we're going to dive into the Greenland situation, and that will bring us closer to maybe painting a picture of the cataclysms that happened only a few thousand years ago.